So, John, I think you can see me and hear me. I don't think
I can. Thank you.
Excellent. There's a funny layout. So I hear you, you see me. I can't see you because you're on a big screen, which I'm not able to see. So that's fine. So first of all, thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to make a presentation and I'll turn the stage to you. So in 2018, John Mandyck started as the first ever Chief Executive Officer for Urban Green Council in New York City. And Urban Green Council is a non-profit organization dedicated to transforming buildings for a sustainable future in New York City and around the world. As I said before, John was for 25 years a Chief Sustainability Officer for United Technology Corporation, a Fortune 45 global leader in building aerospace and food refrigeration industries. And over this period, he developed global expertise in building technologies, building trends, and the green building movement, having conducted business in 53 countries, including Rome, where we had the pleasure to meet several times. John is a visiting scientist at the Harvard University T.H. Chan School of Public Health, where he provides strategy and support to help define the future of healthy, sustainable cities. He was the founding chair of the Corporate Advisory Board for the World Green Building Council and former chair of the Urban Green Council. He's also an adjunct professor at the University of Connecticut School of Business. Throughout his career, John has worked with governments, universities, and organizations around the globe to accelerate environmental sustainability in an increasingly urbanized world. He is the co-author of the book Food Foolish, which explores the hidden connection between food waste, hunger, and climate change. He started the Race to 9 Billion podcast and can be found on Twitter at John Mandyck. In 2019, he partnered with Salida Wall Spitzer to publish What Boards Need to Know About Sustainable Ratings in the Harvard Business Review, summarizing the new financial and social implications of growing ESG transparency. John is a frequent public speaker at industry events, conferences, and universities, providing commentary on the global mega trends impacting the environment, with particular focus on solutions for a more sustainable future. His TEDx talk on the future of food challenges the global paradigm for how to sustainably feed the planet. Very long introduction, but deserved. John, thank you so much for being with us today. And I'll turn the stage to you. I'm going to sit and enjoy your presentation.
Great. Thank you, Francesco. Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to join you. It's an honor to join you. I'm going to thank GBC Italia for all the amazing work that it has done over the many years and continues to do. And it's been my great pleasure to work with your organization for so long and to continue to do so today. So I hope your class is going well. Today I'm going to talk to you about what we're doing in New York City from a green building and climate change perspective that I hope you find interesting. And my talk will allow plenty of time for questions and answers and discussion when I'm done, if you'd like to probe any of the topics further. So why don't we jump right in to the next slide, please. So as Francesco mentioned, the mission of Urban Green is to transform buildings. What we do is work on the carbon footprint reduction of buildings. We do that in New York, but increasingly we see New York as an ideal laboratory for urban climate solutions. And so we are actively engaging with other organizations around the world to import best ideas and to also share ideas that we have that may work in other cities. Now, we do that in 4 ways on the next slide. The first way is that we convene. We bring people together to solve big problems. We have a long history of doing this. This is our 20th anniversary year at Urban Green. We're young as an organization, but actually quite seasoned as a climate change advocate. And convening is a big part of what we do. So for example, Mayor Bloomberg appointed Urban Green to develop the city's resiliency plan after our Hurricane Sandy incident. In that exercise, we brought together 300 experts just in the course of 8 months to develop the city's resiliency plan that was passed by the city council. So convening is a big part of what we do to get the best ideas from the broadest range of stakeholders. The second thing that we do is research. On the next slide, we do that to inform public policy and to drive conversation. Our research fills gaps, either for the market to move or for public policies to be enacted. We have our own in-house data analyst team, and I'll show you through the course of the presentation some of the examples of the research that we do. On the next slide, the third thing that we do is policy work. And since 2010, more than 70 pieces of legislation have been enacted that were either proposed by Urban Green or touched by Urban Green or supported by Urban Green in one form or another. So working with the government and helping to pass new laws on sustainability and green buildings and climate change is a big part of what we do. And then the fourth area of focus on the next slide is training and education. We've reached more than 47,000 people with our training programs, which run the full spectrum of energy code training to green building training for the building trades on best ways to actually operate buildings in a more sustainable way. So those are our four key activities in what we do. On the next slide, we do all that because buildings matter. This is the carbon profile of New York City. And buildings represent nearly 70% of carbon emissions in New York City. And the largest source by far, that 40%, is burning fossil fuels at the building, burning gas or oil at the building for heat and hot water. That is our number one source of carbon emissions across the entire city. And it's a big challenge that we have to tackle, and we'll show you some ways that we're trying to do that. On the next slide, we have a lot at stake in New York City for the work that we do. New York has $3 trillion of insured coastal properties. That's $3 trillion. That's twice the GDP of Canada. So that's what's at stake from the threats of climate change. And on the next slide, we know that climate change is not theory in New York, it's reality. We've witnessed it time and again. Part of that is sea level rise. So the sea level in New York Harbor is up 1 foot, 12 inches in the last 100 years. Which makes storm events, coastal storm events, even more impactful as waters literally come over the harbor into New York City. And it's not just sea level rise, it's increasing storm events on the next slide. This is a subway line that I ride all the time in New York City. After a big storm that hit in September, that dropped a record 7 inches of rain in just less than an hour in New York City. In a city like New York, the water goes directly into the subways. It becomes the drain. And it creates catastrophic events where our subway lines become underground rivers in big storms. So it's not just the classical hurricanes that we have to be worried about. It's the increasing intensity of storms as they come across. And this wasn't even a coastal storm. This was a storm that came up across the country and just dumped a lot of rain on us, and tragic. More than 10 people died in basement apartments in New York City just from the immediate and sudden flooding that occurred. On the next slide, I told you that buildings represent 70% of the carbon emissions in New York City. But big buildings are actually starting to play their role. We have a law to reduce carbon emissions 80% by 2050. In the last 10 years, big buildings have reduced carbon emissions 28%. which gives us hope that we can get to our climate goals. Half of that progress is the greening of our grid in New York. The other half of that progress is actually investments at the building to increase energy efficiency. So this is a good trend line for where we want to go. This is an example of our research. New York City requires large buildings to file annual energy and water use. And we take that data and we pull big trends out of it. And so this research is available on our website. We've been doing this for now 12 years in New York City. It's one of the largest big building data sets in the world. So in the next slide, we wanted to understand, okay, how do we institutionalize the role buildings can play for our zero carbon future? And so we put together one of our convenings called the 80 by 50 Buildings Partnership a few years ago, where we brought together 70 experts from 42 organizations. We met 80 times to come up with consensus recommendations for how buildings could be put on path to meet the 80% carbon reductions by 2050. On the next slide, we delivered our recommendations to the New York City Council, which is our legislative body. The City Council was actually sending observers to our meeting to get a jump start on the technicalities of the issues that we wanted to discuss. And so in record time, the New York City Council passed what we know as the Climate Mobilization Act. On the next slide. This is historic legislation that puts annual carbon caps on buildings starting in 2024 and then tightening in 2030 all the way to 2050. I'll go through the details of this law, but when implemented, it will deliver the largest carbon reduction of any city in the world. So it's meaningful in its approach to reduce carbon emissions from one of the world's largest cities. On the next slide, this is what's covered in this law. The building covers the law covers buildings that are 25,000 square feet and above. Francesco, I'm sorry, I forgot to do the metric conversion quickly before we started. So 25,000 square feet and above. That level represents nearly 60% of the floor area of New York City. So we have 1 million buildings in New York City. When you draw the line at this threshold, it reduces the population to 50,000 buildings. But those 50,000 buildings represent nearly 60% of the floor area of the city. So it's a big, big start. And the number one category of buildings covered are multifamily housing. We think of New York City as the glass office towers in Manhattan. But actually, we have more large residential buildings than we do commercial buildings. And this is a new area, frankly, for urban green. And I would say the green building movement, certainly in the United States, is focused a lot on commercial spaces. Now our focus has to move to multifamily residential. On the next slide, this is how the law works. There are 10 caps for 10 different occupancy groups. So this is just 3 examples here. The first one is for multifamily for apartments for residential. It's 6.75 kilograms per square foot is the cap that those properties can exceed that level in 2024. And then in 2030, the cap is 4.07 kilograms of CO2 per square foot. Now, if you exceed the levels, the fines are very expensive. It's $268 per ton over the cap. That is the new price of carbon in New York City. It's the highest price of carbon that I've seen anywhere in the world. And it's meant to show the seriousness of the city to enforce this law. Now, in the next slide, there are several ways that building owners can comply. The first is to reduce carbon, obviously, and you can do that by improving energy efficiency, which is the first best alternative always. There are some instances where buildings can still switch to lower carbon fuels, from oil to gas, for example, and that will reduce the carbon emissions. The law allows the use of offsets. So for example, building owners can buy renewable energy credits for new renewable power that's being built to come into the New York City grid. The third area we talked about is pay a fine, which is expensive. The fourth area that we're working on right now is trying to find alternative compliance paths. There are many instances in New York where, because of a building's characteristic, there is nothing they can do to get below the cap. One of those is density. If you just have a lot of people working in the building, it's going to produce a lot of carbon emissions, or a lot of people living in the building too. So we need to find a way for those buildings to comply. We don't want people to pay fines, because that's an admission that we don't get the carbon savings, and we need the carbon savings for the challenges that we have. So we're working on ways to have alternative compliance paths. One of our ideas is for building owners, instead of paying a fine, they could pay into a fund that would finance carbon reductions and energy efficiency in low income and affordable housing buildings. So that's one idea that we're pursuing right now. On the next slide, not all buildings are subject to the cap, most are, but for low income housing and for churches and houses of worship, they aren't subject to the cap, but they aren't exempt. They are required to do a checklist of measures such as weatherization and LED lighting and controls and insulation. And this is meant to get carbon savings that we need in those buildings too, but to do it in a way that is less costly and more affordable. And then finally, for city-owned buildings, on the next slide, the city of New York is the largest owner of buildings in New York City, with schools and housing centers and city offices and bus depots, et cetera. So the city-owned buildings actually have a higher carbon reduction to meet, which is 40% by 2025 and 50% by 2030. And actually the city is on its way to meeting its goals. It's doing some very impressive things in its buildings to achieve energy efficiency and carbon reduction. On the next slide, outside of this, I wanted to share a new law on top of all of this that covers new construction. Obviously, that law that I just shared with you is for existing buildings, which is by far our #1 source of emissions. But for new construction, just in December, New York City enacted a fossil fuel ban in new buildings, which means new buildings will no longer be allowed to use natural gas or oil for anything, heating, cooking, hot water. These will have to be all electric buildings. We're the largest city in the world to take this big step. And I'm proud to say that the law that was enacted was based on a proposal that Urban Green put together and advanced with many stakeholders. Our law starts in 2024 for buildings under 7 floors that can no longer have, new buildings can no longer be built with a natural gas hookup. And then in 2027, buildings 7 floors or more kick in. Now there's some exceptions for 1 to 2 family homes from a hot water perspective. That's hot water is our biggest technical challenge now from a hot water heat pump standpoint. And we're frankly looking for big solutions from Europe to make it to the United States. But we're proud of this law and the role it will play in our low carbon future for new buildings in New York. And then my last slide that I want to wrap up on is another example of the research that we do that we just released 2 weeks ago, which was analyzing the impact of COVID on buildings. And so we had our first, the 2020 building data, the benchmarking data that was required by the city was released. And so we took a deep dive to look at it. And what we found is that obviously the pandemic has significantly shifted how and where we use energy in New York City. Our big question right now is whether this is a blip or if this is a long-term trend. But there were three major findings on this. First has to do with the grid. So energy use in New York City was down 9% in 2020, the first year of the pandemic. But our carbon emissions were only down 7%. That speaks to the fact that our grid is just too dirty in New York City, that we rely too much on natural gas to generate electricity. And so this is a good reminder that more and more has to be done to bring in renewable sources of power for our electrical grid. And that's happening. I'm happy to see it's happening. This is a good reminder for it. The second big trend that we saw was in office buildings. So energy use in office buildings was down 14%, while occupancy was down 60% or more. We call this the great energy disconnect. At the height of the pandemic, office occupancy was down 90%, yet energy use was only down 14%. And so, or said a different way, we have a very, very high base energy load for empty buildings. And so we thought we knew everything about buildings. The pandemic taught us that there's more to learn and how buildings can and should adapt to office occupancy from an energy standpoint. We have to do better than this for not only during the pandemic, but post-pandemic. And then the next issue, or third issue, what we found fascinating was what happened with residential energy use. So actually for electricity, residential energy use went down 3.6%, which we thought didn't make sense because everybody went home and most people were working from home. So why would electricity use go down citywide 3.6%? Well, as we dove into the numbers to do the analysis, what quickly came to light was the map that you see here. So New York has 5 boroughs, or you could consider them to be 5 mini cities within the city of New York. And in 4 out of those 5 boroughs, we saw energy use go up. But in the borough of Manhattan, energy use went down significantly, 8%. And that actually dragged down the whole city average. So if we didn't actually look at all of the boroughs, we wouldn't have understood what was going on here. And what's fascinating here is the way we backed into this was actually looking at water, because energy use isn't tracked by occupancy. But if you see a building that sees, is down to nearly zero water or very, very low water, you know that nobody's in that building. And so we collaborated water use to energy use to understand what was happening in occupancy. And the storyline here is people in Manhattan left during the pandemic. They are the more affluent people from an income standpoint who could afford to leave New York. And that drew down the city average of electricity. We'll have to see what happens over time. I can tell you that all those people are back. Not everybody's back in the office though. So the trends here will be interesting to watch in the coming years. And then just on my final slide here, again, I want to thank you for spending time. I want to thank GBC Italia for all the great work. On this final slide, if we can move to it, has our social media handles. If you'd like to follow our work at Urban Green and our website here, we publish all of the research that you've seen today or is published on our site, with a lot of other reports that you might find interesting. So with Francesco, with that, I'll stop and happy to take any questions that you or the group may have.
Okay. So Marco is referring to this, in a slide you were showing the number of meetings, something like 1,300 meetings that you have done in those 8 months in order to get to the point where you're going. The question is, we were the primary no's, the primary no we can't do, the primary hurdles, obstacles that you have to overcome in order to get where you're getting?
Yeah, it's a good question. Thank you, Marco. It's nice to see you. The challenge we have in New York is like the challenge we're having across our country in the United States, is that our politics are getting polarized on both sides. And that's the same in the green building space, where progressive groups in New York City want buildings to do more, faster. Building owners understand that they have a responsibility to reduce carbon emissions, but that comes at a very high cost. And so it's not that they don't want to act, but they may not want to act as quickly as people want them to. So we play an interesting role in the middle, trying to help all parties understand each other. And so that's our big challenge. It's typically over, how far and how fast. The good news is, we don't have anybody in New York City who denies climate change, and certainly not the building community, and certainly not the building owners. Building owners understand we need to reduce carbon emissions. What we try to point out is it's in their own financial interest to do so. I showed you that we have $3 trillion of insured coastal properties at risk to climate change.
Maybe let me clarify this. Non so se avete compreso, sono 3 triliardi di dollari di valore immobiliare, sono 2 volte il prodotto interno lordo del Canada, right? You said twice the GDP of Canada, right. Is that right? Quello è il valore che è a rischio, diciamo, solo in quell'area. Sorry, just go ahead, just to make sure that, we understand the value.
Right, that's the point. And what I'm trying to say, what I'm trying to tell them is you need to rethink what the payback calculation is.
Payback.
Because you're not factoring the full risk of climate change when you have to think through the investments that need to be made at buildings. We've seen a couple climate events that have shut down New York City. And so we are within sight of a city that will not function the way that it has in the past. Yeah. And we have to continue to appropriately build in that risk from a financial perspective when we think about payback.
Yeah, absolutely. Quindi c'è tutto questo. John, from my end, I have a question for you. We talk a lot about rating systems and how these certification tools are perceived, are used. What is your idea? What's your position with regards with these tools? Which obviously, are they still, playing a role? Can you elaborate your position on that? Where do you see them?
Yes. So I think rating systems play a big role, especially globally. Rating systems actually play a big role in the United States. They just don't play as big a role in New York City because our local laws are more stringent than the rating systems. And so, if you want to you pick whatever your rating system is, that's what the law requires, or the law requires more. Now, I fully understand that New York City is a different place. We have many cities across the United States that have no energy laws. And so in those cities, rating systems are extremely important because they become the de facto energy code.
Yeah.
So it depends on where you are. Overall, I'm a big believer in rating systems, and they've certainly transformed the marketplace. It's just that in New York City, our governments have gone farther, faster. And so we're actually at a point where we need to understand what's the relevancy of rating codes in cities like New York, and how can they adapt?
Okay.
Hello,
my name is Nicola Mazza, and I tell you that I'm promoting here in Italy vacuum system for toilets. And I would like to ask you a question about this. If you ever considered in your design to use vacuum toilets to reduce the quantity of water for each flush, because the peculiarity of this system that is 1 liter per flush is very small amount of water if compared with the gravity toilets. So if applied in a large scale, it could contribute to the reduction of the carbon footprint because we reduce the quantity of water to be used in the buildings, and also the water to be treated after the use. So your opinion, if you ever used this technology, or if you think it could be useful in the future. Thank you.
Certainly, thank you for the question. I always like hearing about new technologies. I'm a firm believer that the only way that we're going to get out of the climate crisis that we're in is through the adoption of new technologies. I'm not completely familiar with that technology. And to be honest, the focus of the public policy agenda in New York has not been on water, it's been on energy itself. And we're not in a water distressed region in New York, thankfully. So there hasn't been a big policy focus on water. Now you make an interesting point about wastewater treatment, which does show up in our greenhouse gas emissions chart. And so, maybe that's a stronger connection that should be made between water reduction and reduced climate emissions on the back end. But as a big public policy goal, kind of water reduction isn't big on the agenda as it would be in other parts of the United States. And the Western United States is in an absolute crisis. In California and Arizona and Nevada, where reservoir levels are at such a low level that they're below historical records. And these states are literally poised to run out of water this summer. So it's a crisis there. And my guess is those types of technologies would be welcome there first. But I like your idea of connecting lower water use to lower water treatment use, which would reduce carbon emissions.
Thank you for the question. John, I know that Marco wants to close and greet you.
So I think it's another important goal we achieved here, John, and thank you so much to you and your bargaining council. I can focus more small things. First, I think the importance of the community. This changing, I think, is not possible without an agreement and a community approach. So I think Urban Green Council has done a very great job in New York, and we are very proud to be partnering together in the next future as to share, not only to share, but to study solutions in Italy too. And this is the first, the importance of community. Second, I think the importance of leadership. But the importance of leadership and the central point of leadership is very, very, it's so important. Why? It's so important because we have different kind of leadership in different aspects. You told us the main focus is energy, and you know very well that there are circular economy, there are water consumption, and so on. And this is one of the reasons why the Energy Environmental Protocol is useful for the changing of the market. And now we define a new point and maybe a new leadership to spread together that is related to heritage. You know, we have a lot of historic building here. You know very well, we defined the first Energy Environmental Protocol for sustainable building applied to heritage and historical building. It's called GBC Historic Building. And maybe you know we helped, and we are very honored to help the G20 2021 Commission trying to spread not only an idea of circular city, but the merge between heritage and sustainability. And we told you, and we hope that our partnership with the United States and Italy that asked Italy to go on in this bilateral is when grows this kind of partnership, and I hope this, I'm working on this, I hope that you, John, personally, and Urban Green Council can be our partners in this journey. The last thing I would like to underline is the importance of the model. You are talking us about a PPP approach, public and private partnership. This is the other goal we need to improve in Italy. We are aware of this, but we need to well spread this kind of model. How all together we can solve our problems and not, Pope Francis say, no one save itself alone. So it's important to have the community, it's important on the market to merge all the effort of public and private communities. So I think this is one other challenge maybe we can achieve, and we hope you will join us and we will see together in these next steps, maybe for Italy, but if you look at heritage and sustainability approach, maybe not only for Italy, but to spreading something that can be interesting for New York and maybe for the world.
Right. Well, thank you, Marco, for those kind words, and congratulations to you and Francesco, and keep up the great work. We need you to do what you're doing, and we appreciate it very much.
Thank you. So I think we can close, Francesco, now.
Absolutely. I think I know that you have to go because you have something to do, but you need to come back to Rome, John, because you have to come and check if the HVAC system at the existing chapter still works.
Yeah,
because
that's definitely a job for me.
I know,
Yes.
because Marco mentioned the Pope, and apparently the other day the temperatures were a little bit too high.
So facciamo un altro applauso a John, and thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Ciao.